They call him the most hated president by powerful world leaders. Why? Because he chose his people over their influence. But when an assassination plot was set in motion, with betrayal from within, no one expected a cow to be the reason he survived. This is the unbelievable true story of how fate stepped in to protect Ibrahim Traoré. The thick Sahelian air hung low over Ouagadougou that morning, heavy with the weight of unspoken tension. Within the presidential palace, golden light bounced off the marble floors. But beneath the surface calm, a storm was quietly building. Interim President Ibrahim Traoré stood alone on the veranda, looking out at the horizon. His eyes, sharp and clear, scanned the distant skyline, his mind burdened, yet unwavering. At just 34 years old, Traoré had become a symbol of defiance across Africa. In a time when many nations bent under the pressure of external powers, he stood unbending. His public statements had stirred international controversy. "We do not need the crumbs of imperialism," he had declared. "Burkina Faso will rise, on its own terms, for its own people." The words resonated with millions, but also ignited fury among global elites and former colonial forces. Those in the shadows saw him not as a reformer, but a threat. His refusal to allow foreign troops or Western economic interference had made him a target, not just politically, but physically. Inside the palace, among the few allowed into the inner circle, was a man named Malik Zango. Only 29, Malik was clever, quiet, and fiercely ambitious. As the president's personal assistant, he enjoyed rare access, managing Traoré's schedule, knowing his routes, even his moments of rest. He had been at the president's side during critical decisions and late-night strategy sessions. But Malik had secrets. 2 months prior, during a diplomatic event in Dakar, a shadowy figure from a foreign Eigen delegation had approached him. Their conversation was brief, vague compliments, insinuations of future opportunities. A week later, a secure phone was delivered anonymously to Malik's home. From that day, the calls began, each one more insistent than the last. Offers of money, passports, a villa in Europe. The cost? Just one thing: help them remove Ibrahim Traoré. At first, Malik laughed off the idea, but pressure has a way of cracking even the strongest facades. His family, living in a modest home outside Bobo Dioulasso, had been followed. A cousin was attacked by unknown men. It was subtle, but deliberate. The message was clear: comply or lose everything. Reluctantly, Malik agreed. The plan was chillingly precise. A stretch of rural road, Route N5, outside the capital, known for its winding turns and poor visibility, would be rigged with a small but powerful explosive device. Not a crude car bomb, but a military-grade IED planted underground and triggered by a pressure sensor. The perfect accident. Traoré was scheduled to visit a youth outreach center in Koudougou the following week. Malik ensured that Route N5 was selected for the motorcade's journey. As the day approached, Malik's anxiety grew. Every smile he gave the president, every briefing he delivered, felt like a lie. Because it was. But he told himself this was necessary. Burkina Faso needed stability. The world powers would ensure that. Traoré was too idealistic, too dangerous. He would understand, in the end. What Malik hadn't accounted for, however, was Traoré's intuition. The president had grown more cautious since the recent failed coup attempt. He'd begun changing his travel routes last minute, often without informing even his top aides. On the morning of the Koudougou visit, just after sunrise, he called a brief security meeting in his private study. "I have a feeling," he said quietly to his head of security, Commandant Issouf. "Route N5, it doesn't sit right with me. We go through the eastern bypass. Make it discreet. Don't even tell the motorcade until the last junction." Issouf nodded, saying nothing. He knew better than to question the president's instincts. Over the past year, they'd saved lives. Malik was stunned when the motorcade suddenly rerouted outside Ouagadougou. He tried to mask his panic. He sent a quick, encrypted text using the burner phone. "Reroute. Plan in danger. The response came back. Too late. It's set. Sweat trickled down his spine. The convoy weaved through the eastern bypass, an area flanked by fields and scattered bushland. The tension was thick. Soldiers in the lead vehicles scanned every roadside. Yet Malik's mind was far from the surroundings. He was waiting for the blast, for the sound that would confirm the worst. And then, nothing. Silence. Just the steady hum of engines, the rhythmic thud of tires over dirt. Later that day, back in the palace, the news broke. An explosion had occurred along Route N5, just past mile marker 42. The crater was massive, blasted 5 feet deep into the ground. Locals reported seeing military trucks at the scene, followed by foreign agents being escorted out of the country under diplomatic immunity. But what baffled everyone was what had delayed the president's convoy. Reports came in from eyewitnesses who had been stationed along the road. A single brown and white cow had wandered onto the path and stood motionless, blocking the road near a turn. The lead vehicle had come to a halt. Drivers honked, soldiers tried to shoo it away, but it refused to move. Eventually, after more than 10 minutes of futile coaxing, Commandant Issouf had given the signal to reroute entirely. That decision, prompted by a seemingly ordinary animal, had saved Ibrahim Traoré's life. President Traoré never spoke of it publicly that day. But that evening, as he looked over the security footage and saw the animal standing still, defiant as stone, he murmured softly, "Even God sends guardians we least expect." The aftermath of the failed assassination attempt settled like a ghost over Ouagadougou. The sun rose as always, casting golden rays across the rooftops, but something had shifted in the air, an unseen ripple in the rhythm of power. Inside the walls of the presidential compound, silence wasn't peace, it was calculation. President Ibrahim Traoré sat in the Situation Room, staring at an aerial photo of the crater on Route N5. The footage from a military drone showed scorched earth, dislodged soil, and scattered debris. A mere 6 seconds separated the moment his convoy was expected to pass and the timed detonation. 6 seconds, and a cow. That animal, Traoré whispered, not to anyone in particular. It changed the future of a nation. His head of intelligence, Colonel Sanon, remained stoic, but Traoré had known him long enough to see the storm behind his eyes. The colonel laid a dossier on the table, a crisp blue folder with red-sealed tabs. The explosives were military grade, too advanced to be homemade, French origin. We traced the serial fragments to a batch sent to Niger in 2020 under joint training exercises. They should never have ended up here. Traoré didn't flinch. And the detonator? Israeli circuitry, commercial, reprogrammed for delayed impact. It was planted 4 days ago, according to seismic logs and satellite timestamps. There was a long pause. And the leak? Colonel Sanon hesitated. Then he placed another folder beside the first, smaller, thinner, with one name written across the top. Malik Zango. The president's expression barely changed. But beneath the surface, emotions swirled, disappointment, betrayal, and a deep, old pain. He had once seen Malik as a younger brother, someone who embodied the hope of a new generation. To think that the betrayal had come from within, it stung more than any bullet ever could. He's in custody, Sanon nodded. Taken quietly this morning. He confessed. It wasn't just money. They threatened his family, tracked his cousin. They used fear to plant loyalty. Traoré stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out over the palace gardens. His thoughts raced not just to Malik, but to the vast machinery that had almost ended him. This wasn't just about one man. This was about decades of puppeteering, decades of quiet wars waged through bribes, coups, and propaganda. A war he was now at the center of. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, London, and Paris, high-level meetings buzzed behind closed doors, Briefings were updated, names were redacted, satellite images were reinterpreted. Officially, no nation had involvement in the attempt. Unofficially, too many fingers had touched the plan for accountability to be clean. "He's more dangerous alive now than ever," one European diplomat was overheard saying. "The people see him as chosen. Blessed, even." In African capitals, whispers grew. Traoré's survival had become legend overnight. Social media erupted with memes, prayers, and artistic depictions of the sacred cow of Burkina Faso. Children drew the animal in school. Religious leaders called it divine intervention. Village griots wove the tale into song. More than once, Traoré received villagers at the gates of the palace. Men and women who walked for miles simply to say, "God is with you." The cow, in their eyes, wasn't just an animal. It was a sign, a symbol of purity, protection, and a turning tide. But while the people sang, the institutions shook. Inside the United Nations, quiet resolutions began to circulate, statements of concern over democratic transparency in Burkina Faso. News outlets, long silent, began to publish critical op-eds questioning Traoré's leadership, suggesting rising authoritarianism, economic instability, and human rights concerns. Old tactics, dressed in new language. The president read them all. He wasn't naive. He knew what came next. Still, he did not flinch. Late one evening, 2 days after the attack, he walked alone through the palace courtyard. The stars above Burkina Faso stretched endlessly, ancient and bright. He stopped beneath an old baobab tree planted by Thomas Sankara himself, another revolutionary silenced by betrayal. A soft voice approached behind him. It was Awa, his longtime confidant and head of his humanitarian council. She had been silent during much of the past 2 days, watching him with concern. "You haven't slept," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "Can't afford to. Not now." Awa stepped closer. "What will you do about Malik?" There was a pause. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants justice. Another part remembers the boy who carried my bags during the student protests, who refused to leave my side in Ziniare when the security detail vanished. Forgiveness isn't weakness, Ibrahim." "No," he replied quietly, "but it must serve a purpose." They stood in silence. Then Awa added, "The people believe you were spared for something greater. Don't let that belief become just another story. Use it. Channel it." The next morning, President Traoré called a press conference. The room overflowed. National reporters, international journalists, even freelancers hoping for a glimpse of the man whose life had been spared by fate, or perhaps something greater. He stood behind the podium, not with fanfare, but with the quiet gravity of a man who understood his moment in history. "Yes," he said firmly, "there was an attempt on my life." Gasps filled the room. Cameras snapped. He didn't flinch. It was orchestrated by cowards hiding behind institutions, enabled by those who profit from chaos. They failed, not because of superior technology, but because their arrogance blinded them. He paused, then added, "A cow saved my life. That is not a metaphor. That is reality." Laughter bubbled in some corners, unsure whether it was a joke, but his face remained resolute. "Let that remind you," he continued, "that the smallest, most humble among us can change the course of destiny. We don't need saviors from abroad. We need strength within." The room fell silent. Not a word. Just the pulse of history pressing down. He ended with a single line. "Burkina Faso will not bow, not to bullets, not to bombs, and not to fear." Later that night, villagers gathered in fields across the country, lighting fires, singing songs of resistance. Children mimicked the tale of the cow that saved a president. And in a small village outside Ouagadougou, an elderly woman knelt beside her brown and white cow, feeding it mango peelings. "You did well, child," she whispered. "You stopped death." the tale of a cow that defied an atomic device, one which saved the life of Burkina Faso's interim president, IBRAHIM Traoré, continued to echo far beyond the arid stretches of West Africa. What began as an attempted coup, fueled by foreign greed and internal betrayal, had transformed into a spiritual reckoning. The world had expected silence, perhaps even submission, but the opposite happened. IBRAHIM Traoré didn't just survive, he awakened a continent. In the days following his historic speech, images of the sacred cow went viral worldwide. Artists from Ghana to Greece recreated its likeness, some abstract, some majestic. TikTok clips showed children reenacting the scene with toy cars and cardboard cows. In Kenya, a preacher declared the animal a divine angel. In Brazil, Afro-descendant groups marched in solidarity, chanting, "Não à dominação ocidental," no to Western domination. For every insult launched by foreign analysts calling him irrational or unqualified, tenfold voices rose in praise from the streets of Bamako, Freetown, and Harare. IBRAHIM Traoré had become more than a military leader. He was the embodiment of an African dream long buried under debt, colonization, and corruption. But dreams attract hunters. In France, a former intelligence officer leaked information on a closed-door meeting involving senior diplomats. Their concern? That Traoré's survival had created a domino effect in Africa. Already young officers in Senegal and Chad were whispering. Others in Central Africa and even Madagascar were voicing support. Some leaders started refusing IMF terms. One by one, embassies began observing that dangerous word creep into the public lexicon again. Sovereignty. A second wave of destabilization was quietly being planned, only this time it would not rely on explosions. It would use debt, media, and disinformation. False reports flooded social platforms claiming Traoré was mentally unstable. Fabricated quotes were attributed to him. Photoshopped images tried to show tension among his ranks. French-language outlets claimed his military was preparing mass arrests, even ethnic purges. None of it was true. Yet amid this digital assault, Traoré did something unexpected. He opened the palace gates. Literally. He launched a series of public dialogues called The People's Fire, gathering civilians, farmers, students, and even former enemies around bonfires in every region of the country. No elite barriers, no guards, just raw honesty. He spoke less, listened more. And through this grassroots truth-telling, a deeper transformation began. One night, in a northern village near Djibo, a girl no older than 10 stood before him during one of these gatherings. Her eyes burned with quiet rage. "They say you are brave, but my mother still eats only once a day. My school has no roof. My uncle died in the mines you gave back to the country. Why should we believe in your miracles?" Silence fell over the crowd. A guard stepped forward to pull her back. Traoré raised his hand. "No," he said. "Let her speak." He bent to one knee to look her in the eyes. "You're right," he said. "And if in 2 years you still eat once a day, I will not be president." The crowd exploded into thunderous applause, but not because of bravado. It was the rare, aching sound of a population hearing the words of a leader willing to answer to a child. That night, a video of the encounter reached 12 million views in 48 hours. The caption read, "Africa is listening again." But back in Ouagadougou, Malik Zango, the young PA turned would-be traitor, sat in a secured military cell, remorse gripping him harder than any chains. He watched these transformations unfold from a small TV screen in the guard's room. He hadn't been sentenced, not officially, but the weight of his betrayal bore down on him. Each night, he scribbled letters. To his sister, to Traoré, to no one. One letter read, "I tried to kill the only man who ever believed in me. I let fear blind my purpose. I was wrong." One morning, unannounced, the cell door opened. IBRAHIM Traoré entered. Alone. Malik dropped to his knees, eyes brimming with tears. I don't deserve to speak, he whispered. Traoré looked down at him, not with hate, but with the weariness of a man who understood what pressure could do to a soul. Do you know why I haven't executed you? He asked calmly. Malik didn't speak. Because the revolution we're building has no room for vengeance, only justice. He handed Malik a small envelope. Inside, a presidential pardon. Conditional. You'll leave this cell, Traoré said. But you'll work. You'll build schools, clean the roads, teach others how easy it is to be turned into a weapon. Malik wept. It wasn't redemption. It was responsibility. Months passed, then a year. Burkina Faso didn't become a utopia. But things changed. Solar panels lit villages that had known only darkness. Old, unused railway tracks were repaired by former militias turned civil engineers. Women were appointed to regional councils. Land once seized by French mining companies was redistributed into local cooperatives. Burkina Faso, once a forgotten dot on the map, had become a blueprint. And through it all, one cow remained in a remote field near the explosion site. Healthy, cared for by villagers who named her Sita, meaning the light in Dioula. Pilgrims visited her. Poets wrote about her. A mural of Sita, painted across a public school wall, bore the words, "Even the humble can interrupt destruction." Meanwhile, the world adapted. Slowly. The African Union began drafting new sovereignty clauses. Caribbean nations expressed solidarity. Even a few European activists marched in protest of continued neocolonialism, holding up signs that read, "Traoré taught us courage." The young president was no longer just a survivor. He had become a symbol. Flawed, yes, but relentless. He was not the hero the world designed, but the one it needed. And every so often, as he walked the fields of his homeland or sat under the shadow of that old baobab, IBRAHIM TRAORÉ would smile to himself. Not because he believed the war was over, but because he knew something fundamental had changed. A cow had blocked a path that day. But in doing so, it opened the road to a future no one had dared imagine.